The bulldozer's diesel engine roared like a wounded animal at 5:47 in the morning, and Marcus Webb knew, standing barefoot in the Kentucky frost with a cup of cold coffee in his trembling hand, that he had exactly 12 minutes before everything his grandfather built would become a parking lot for a shopping mall that nobody in this county needed. The banker had been clear, polite even. That's what made it worse. Politeness wrapped around devastation feels like betrayal dressed up as civility. Marcus had watched the man's manicured fingers slide across the laminated foreclosure papers in the walnut-paneled office downtown, and he'd thought about how many seasons of sweat it takes to make a man's hands look like his, weathered, cracked, embedded with soil that no amount of water could ever wash completely clean. His father had died 3 years ago, heart attack in the tractor seat. The old 1920 farm-all that his grandfather had bought new, that had turned over thousands of acres, that had become something between a family heirloom and a piece of living history. Marcus had never wanted to sell it. He'd wanted to restore it, actually, wanted to spend the kind of time with it that his father never got to spend, the kind of time that builds memories in the spaces between generations. But restoration costs money. Taxes cost money. The medical bills from his mother's stroke cost money. And when the market crashed 3 years ago, when the tobacco contracts dried up and the corn prices fell below the cost of seed, money became the one thing the Webb family no longer had. Here's the thing about losing your land that nobody tells you. And I know some of you watching this right now, from Tennessee, from West Virginia, from rural Ohio, and the backwoods of Georgia understand exactly what I'm saying. When you lose your land, you lose the conversation with your past. You lose the place where your family's decisions echo across decades. You lose the ground that holds your story. So before we continue, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching from a small town, from a place where land means something more than square footage on a real estate listing, hit that subscribe button. And in the comments, tell me, what state are you watching from? What's the story of the place you call home? Because these stories matter. They deserve to be heard. The sun was breaking now, bleeding orange across the frozen fields, and Marcus could see the man in the yellow hard hat climbing down from the bulldozer cab. There were 3 other machines lined up behind it. Excavators, a compactor, a crane. The development company had sent an entire battalion to erase his family's name from this land. Marcus turned back to the house. His mother was watching from the window, her left hand hanging useless at her side from the stroke, her face pressed against the glass like she was trying to push through into a different timeline, one where this morning never happened. He'd wanted to protect her from this. He told her to stay upstairs, to not watch. But you can't shield people from their own dispossession. Some things you have to witness. The tractor was parked beside the barn, the 1920 farm-all. Red paint faded to the color of old blood. Tires cracked from decades of standing in the sun. Marcus had spent 100 Saturday mornings looking at that machine, thinking about what it would cost to bring it back, knowing all the while that he'd never have the money. His father had spent the last 8 hours of his life on that seat, had felt his chest tighten, had gripped the steering wheel as his vision narrowed, had died alone with the smell of turned earth and motor oil filling his lungs. Marcus had found him the next morning. He walked to the tractor now, moving slowly, knowing that the banker's men were watching him. Let them watch. Let them catalogue his grief like it was inventory. He ran his hand across the seat, cracked leather, springs pushing through, the fabric worn thin in the exact shape of his father's body. The seat was original, never replaced. His grandfather had installed it in 1920, and his father had inherited it, and Marcus had inherited it. And if Marcus sold the tractor, which he'd tried to do, God knew he'd tried, he would lose even this small piece of continuity. The seat where 3 generations of Webb men had made decisions about crops and weather and the future had become the closest thing Marcus had to communion with his past. He sat down now, not thinking about anything in particular, just existing in that seat, feeling the shape of his father's absence. The leather was ice cold. His breath came out in clouds that hung in the February air like his own thoughts made visible. That's when he felt it. At first he thought it was a spring, that the deteriorating seat had finally lost structural integrity and was stabbing him. But the pain was specific, localized, sharp in a way that felt intentional. He shifted his weight and felt it again. There was something hard inside the seat, something that had been there for decades, packed between the leather exterior and the internal structure. Marcus looked around. The bulldozer operator was checking his machine. The banker's assistant was on her phone. Nobody was paying attention to the man sitting on a tractor that was about to become scrap metal. He used his pocket knife to cut carefully into the leather, not destroying it, just creating an opening along the seam where the damage was already obvious. His fingers found paper, old paper, the kind that's been sealed away from air and light for so long that it's become brittle and yellowed. His heart was moving fast now, and he couldn't explain why. It was just paper. It meant nothing. He pulled it out carefully, aware that it might fall apart, aware that whatever this was, it had survived a century in darkness and couldn't survive carelessness now. The paper unfolded in his hands, careful, careful, revealing handwriting that was precise and formal, the kind of handwriting that men learned in the 1920s when penmanship was considered a moral quality. The letterhead read, Cumberland Bank and Land Company. The date was March 14th, 1926. And as Marcus read the words his grandfather had hidden in the seat of this tractor 100 years ago, words that detailed a land transaction, a deed, a property transfer, and most importantly, a clause that had never been formally recorded, a clause that gave ownership rights that had technically never passed through proper channels because his grandfather had hidden the evidence. Marcus understood something that made his hands shake. The land wasn't foreclosed, not legally. Not if this document meant what he thought it meant. Not if his grandfather had done what the handwriting seemed to suggest. Marcus sat in the tractor seat with the document trembling in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, since the moment he'd found his father's body cooling in this exact spot, he felt something other than the constant weight of inevitability pressing down on his chest. He felt possibility. And possibility, he was learning, was sometimes more terrifying than despair. The handwriting continued across multiple pages. His grandfather, Thomas Webb, who'd bought this land in 1920 for cash that came from somewhere nobody in the family had ever adequately explained, had apparently made a deal that wasn't quite a deal. A transaction that looked like a transaction on the surface, but contained a legal loophole so specific, so deliberately constructed that it suggested his grandfather had either hired the smartest lawyer in Kentucky or had been the smartest lawyer himself. Marcus had never known which. What the document said, in the formal language of the 1920s, was this. The Cumberland Bank and Land Company had sold Thomas Webb the property with a clause stating that ownership would revert to the bank only if the deed was formally recorded in the county courthouse within 30 days. Thomas Webb had never recorded it. Instead, he'd hidden this unrecorded deed, this piece of paper that made him the true owner, despite never being officially registered, inside the tractor seat, knowing that as long as the document remained hidden, as long as nobody knew it existed, the legal status of the land would exist in a state of quantum uncertainty. The bank couldn't claim it because they'd already sold it. Webb couldn't be dispossessed because he'd never officially possessed it according to the county records. It was either genius or madness, probably both. And here's what nobody talks about when they discuss generational wealth and poverty: the way that knowledge gets encoded into objects, the way that information survives in the spaces between intention and action. Marcus's grandfather had left him a message across 100 years, a message written in legal language and hidden in leather, a message that said, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can own is the secret that you own nothing." The bulldozer operator was beginning the walkthrough now, checking the site one final time before beginning demolition. Marcus had maybe 10 minutes before they started. He photographed the document carefully with his phone, one image per page, making sure the handwriting was legible. His hands were steadier now. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Electricity, purpose. He needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. He needed someone who understood land law, who understood the history of Kentucky property rights, who understood that sometimes the law moves through shadows and implications as much as through recorded fact. He needed someone who wouldn't laugh at him or dismiss the document as irrelevant because it had never been officially registered. He needed someone who understood that power sometimes lives in the spaces between official and unofficial, between documented and hidden. Marcus carefully returned the document to its place inside the seat, photographed the location so he could find it again, and climbed down from the tractor. The sun was fully up now, painting the frost-covered fields in shades of gold that made everything look temporary and sacred at the same time. The bulldozer operator approached him, mid-50s, weathered face, the kind of man who'd spent his life operating machines for other people's dreams and other people's disasters. There was no malice in his expression, which somehow made it worse. This was just his job. This was just Tuesday for him. The Webb family's century of ownership meant nothing to the mechanics of demolition. "We're going to need you off the property in the next few minutes," the man said, not unkindly. Marcus nodded. He walked to the house where his mother was still pressed against the window, her face a map of every fear she couldn't articulate, and he knew he had to tell her something. Not everything, but something that would give her reason to believe that this morning wasn't the end, that the foreclosure papers and the bulldozer and the shopping mall were all based on a false assumption. His mother's name was Eleanor, and she'd spent 63 years on this land. She'd married here, raised children here, buried a husband here. She'd become a part of the soil in the way that only people rooted to a place can become part of it. The stroke had taken her ability to move the left side of her body and had taken her job as a high school English teacher, but it hadn't taken her mind. It hadn't taken her understanding that some losses are too large to survive. "Mama," Marcus said, taking her good hand, "I need you to trust me for a few hours. Pack a bag. We're going to the city. We're going to see a lawyer." She looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and confusion in equal measure. "Marcus, what are you talking about? The papers are signed. It's over." "The papers might be signed," he said, "but the land might not be sold. Not legally, not completely, not if what I just found is what I think it is." He didn't tell her about the tractor seat, didn't tell her about the document, didn't tell her about the loophole that his grandfather had apparently spent enough intellectual energy to construct and hide. Instead, he helped her pack a small bag, locked the house, not that it mattered anymore, the house wasn't his to protect, and drove her to the city in his truck. The drive took 45 minutes. During that time, Eleanor didn't speak. She stared out the window at the landscape of her life scrolling past, and Marcus could see her lips moving, saying things silently, processing something that she didn't yet have language for. The land was disappearing behind them with each mile, becoming something that existed more in memory than in geography. The lawyer's name was David Chen. Marcus found him through a legal database search, chosen because his bio mentioned specialization in property law and historical land disputes. The office was in a building downtown that smelled like old wood and old money, the kind of place where serious things happened to people's lives and nobody made noise about it. Chen was in his 60s, Asian American, with grey in his hair and a scar across his left temple that suggested he'd lived a more interesting life than his current occupation indicated. He listened to Marcus's story without interrupting, his expression remaining perfectly neutral, his eyes tracking the document images that Marcus pulled up on his phone. When Marcus finished, Chen sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "Do you understand what you're suggesting?" Chen finally asked. "I'm suggesting that my grandfather created a legal situation that was never resolved," Marcus said. "I'm suggesting that the deed was never recorded, which means the bank never properly completed the sale. I'm suggesting that according to Kentucky property law from 1926, the ownership of this land exists in a legal limbo." "Not limbo," Chen said carefully. "Ambiguity, which is worse, actually. Limbo is clear, it's an absence of status. Ambiguity means multiple valid interpretations of status, and ambiguity is what gets resolved in courtrooms, not in bank offices." "So you're saying it's possible?" "I'm saying it's more complicated than possible or impossible," Chen replied. "I'm saying that the bank probably did a title search before foreclosing, and if they did, they would have discovered that the 1926 deed was never recorded. Which means they either didn't do their due diligence, or they did, and they didn't think it mattered, because nobody could prove the deed actually existed. They were betting that you wouldn't find it, or that if you did, you wouldn't know what it meant." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. He'd spent 3 years in a state of managed despair, accepting the inevitability of loss. Now he was being asked to imagine a different outcome, and the psychological equivalent of that shift was almost vertigo-inducing. "What do we do?" Marcus asked. "First," Chen said, "we verify the authenticity of the document. We get it examined by an expert in historical documents. We verify the signatures. We establish a chain of custody. Then we file an injunction against the foreclosure and the demolition. We argue that the property status is in dispute and that the bank conducted an improper sale without establishing clear title. It's going to be expensive. It's going to take time. And I'll be honest with you, we might lose. But we might win," Marcus said. "We might," Chen agreed. "Stranger things have happened. Your grandfather was either brilliant or desperate, or both. Either way, he left you something. Whether it's worth anything remains to be seen." The injunction was filed 3 days later. The bulldozers stopped. The development company, surprised and irritated by the legal action, began their own investigation into the title issue. The bank, it turned out, had indeed done a title search. They'd discovered the 1926 deed in the records, and they determined that because the deed was never properly recorded, it was essentially a historical curiosity with no legal weight, except that a historical curiosity is evidence. Evidence that the transaction was never completed. Evidence that suggests that maybe, possibly, the ownership of the land had never actually transferred to the bank at all. What followed was 18 months of legal proceedings that seemed designed specifically to teach Marcus Webb about the nature of power and documentation and the way that history gets weaponized in courtrooms. The bank's lawyers were sharp and expensive and had access to every advantage that money could buy. Chen and Marcus had the document, the argument, and something that probably mattered more, a genuine case of legal ambiguity. The judge ultimately ruled in their favor on a narrow technical point. The 1926 deed, while unrecorded, constituted prima facie evidence that the bank had never completed the sale properly, and therefore the foreclosure was conducted on property to which the bank couldn't establish clear title. The land reverted to Marcus. Not because the system worked perfectly. Not because justice was swift or obvious, but because his grandfather had been smart enough to hide a single piece of paper, and Marcus had been desperate enough to find it, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. 6 months after the ruling, Marcus and a contractor began restoring the 1920 Farmall tractor. The work took 3 years. When it was finished, the machine looked almost exactly as it had looked in 1920. Red paint gleaming, engine purring with the sound of something given a second chance at purpose. Marcus drove it across fields that had almost ceased to belong to him. His mother, her stroke recovery ongoing but her spirit restored, sat beside him in the passenger seat and watched the horizon expand in all directions. The shopping mall never got built. The land remained agricultural. 3 generations of Webmen had fought to stay rooted to this soil, and on this particular morning the victory felt less like triumph and more like the simple privilege of continuity. The tractor seat, original leather still holding its shape, carried them both forward, and somewhere in the fibers of that leather, invisible and permanent, was the memory of his grandfather's decision to hide something valuable in the most obvious place. Inside the thing that everyone could see, but nobody could access. Sometimes power lives in the spaces between intention and action. Sometimes your inheritance is hidden inside the machine that carries you forward. And sometimes the most important document you'll ever own is the one that nobody knew was there.